Hello everyone, I'm Pastor Malcolm Taylor and I have a new series, 4 at this moment, and the title is very simple. I've called it The Message of Power, and I've taken this title from Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. Paul wrote, and he said, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes." And he says that the gospel and the message that we're speaking about is what we call the gospel. And he said this gospel is the power of God. And this gospel is the power of God which is open for everyone who will believe its message. And the gospel very simply means good news. It's actually a Greek word which is euangelon, and you like eulogio, eulogy. Eulogio is a good word, or a eulogy, a blessing. But euangelon is a good declaration, a word of declaration that has good news, something that's announced and that has good news. And Paul says this good news that we announce has power. Now I want to explain the gospel and this good news with two accounts, and the first account, which is explaining this, is Luke chapter 2, and here we see the angels are coming to the shepherds to announce the birth of Jesus, and that truly was the gospel. That truly was good news. And we're just going to read from verses 9 to 10. "And behold, an angel of the Lord stood before the shepherds, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. Then the angel said to them, 'Do not be afraid, for behold, I'm bringing you good tidings,' or good news. I'm bringing you the gospel of great joy, which will be to you and to all people." Now the shepherds were just minding their sheep, and suddenly something happened, and the setting changed. The whole atmosphere that they were in just changed in an extraordinary way. Something supernaturally happened. And I just want to bring to you what that atmosphere was. First of all, it was the glory of the Lord. The setting of this good news was glorious, the glory of the Lord. Then the angel said, "It brings you great joy." And the angel said that everyone can receive it. It's not exclusive, it's not hard to understand. Everyone can receive it. And then then the angel said to the shepherds, "Don't be fearful, don't be afraid. This good news is not fear imparting. It doesn't bring you fear, but it's awesome. Awesome without fear." And that is the nature or the atmosphere of the gospel. And that's how the gospel is a message, but it's different to the message that we just hear. We often hear messages, we hear news, and we hear things like that. But this gospel, Paul says actually in 1 Timothy 1 verse 11, he said it's a glorious gospel. So the gospel that brings power has glory, it's joyful, it's clear for everyone to receive, it's awesome, and it's just totally glorious. Now imagine that if the shepherds were watching over their sheep, and that evening, that night, or in the morning, a friend or even a stranger came to them and said, look, I've got something, I've heard something from the village of Bethlehem, the town of Bethlehem. You know, and also a baby has been born, and this baby is going to be an amazing person and going to have the power of God in their life. Have you heard of this baby that's going to be born? I think the shepherds would have given a different response. They would have said, oh, that sounds good. Maybe we'll check it out in the morning, or maybe if we've got time, we'll go and check it out. But you see, when the angel announced the gospel and announced the good news, we read in Luke chapter 2 and verses 15 and 16, so it was when the angel had gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, let us now go to Bethlehem and see the thing that has come to pass, which the Lord has made known to us. And they came with haste, and they found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in the manger. The gospel always brings, the gospel which has power always is stimulating a response, even an action. It's not neutral, it's not bland, it's glorious, and it brings a response. The next story that really illustrates the gospel is found in Luke chapter 24. It says, now behold, two men were traveling in the same day to the village called Emmaus, which was 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they talked together of all the things that had happened. And so it was while they conversed and reasoned that Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were restrained so that they did not know him. And Jesus said to them, what kind of conversation is this that you have with one another as you walk and are sad? And one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered and said to him, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem? And have you not known the things which happened there in these days? And Jesus said to them, what things? And they said to him, the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, today is the 3rd day since these things happened. Yes, and certain women of our company who arrived at the tomb early astonished us. When they did not find his body, they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And certain of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. So they were discussing a message, and they were discussing Jesus who had died, but also the resurrection. They said, these women are saying, he's not in the tomb, he is risen. And they were discussing what was correct, but they were not discussing the gospel. How can we say that? It's because they were sad, they were gloomy, they were confused, they were not declaring. And so Jesus came and he spoke to them, and Jesus ministered the gospel, and he brought the gospel out. In fact, he began at Moses and all the prophets and expounded to them in the scriptures the wonderful gospel message. And they heard the gospel. Now let's look again, the same chapter, Luke 24, but verses 32 to 33. And they said to one another, did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us on the road and while he opened the scriptures to us? So they rose up at that very hour and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together. See, Jesus proclaimed, he announced the gospel to these two men, and then he revealed himself, and their hearts burned within them. A glory came into their hearts and their mind. They were glad. The sadness changed to joy. They were energized. They were activated. The atmosphere changed. And so what they did was they got up and they rushed back to Jerusalem. What caused them to respond in such a way? It was the gospel, because you see, the gospel is the message of power. It's the message that brings action, brings faith, that brings life. You see, the gospel is good news, but it's more than just good news. The gospel has glory. In the gospel is great joy. The gospel, everyone can receive it and understand it. The gospel is awesome. It doesn't bring fear. The gospel energizes into action. The gospel changes the atmosphere. The gospel is supernatural. Let's just look quickly in Acts chapter 8. Philip preached the gospel, and in verse 5, we read that Philip went down to the city of Samaria and preached Christ to them. He truly preached the gospel. Look at verse 8. And there was great joy in that city. You see, the gospel brings power. The true gospel, yes, it's the message and it's the good news, but it has power that brings change. It even can bring change into a community, into a city, even into a nation. And in Romans chapter 1 and verse 17, we just read this: for in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed. The righteousness is revealed from glory to glory. So the gospel is a revealing message. It reveals. That's another thing about the gospel. It reveals Jesus. It reveals the righteousness of God. It reveals heavenly things. It's supernatural. But now here's another quality of the gospel. The gospel, because it's the message that has power, it also brings division and confrontation. The gospel confronts atmospheres which have darkness. And Jesus really encountered this when he preached the gospel. Jesus, as we know, he preached the gospel message. So, for example, in Luke chapter 6 and verses 10 to 11, here's a man with a withered hand, and when Jesus had looked around at them all, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." That's the gospel. Stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. Can you see glory? Can you see joy? Can you see the awe? Can you see the change in the atmosphere in that room and also in that man's life? But let's look at verse 11. But they were filled with rage. The rulers of the synagogue were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. You see, the gospel brings power, but it also brings confrontation. Luke chapter 13 and verse 14. Here's a woman who had a spirit of infirmity for 18 years. And Jesus said, "Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity." But the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. And he spoke and said, "Aren't there 6 days to do this miracle?" And we see that Paul and Peter and the apostles, when they preached the gospel, they went around doing good, just as Jesus did, but they also stirred up hostility. They brought confrontation. And in fact, Paul said this in Philippians. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 17. He said, "The latter, they're ministering out of love for me, the latter out of love, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel." Paul said, "I've chosen, my life is dedicated to this message of power. My life is dedicated to defend the gospel." Paul was willing to choose persecution more than to choose compromise of the gospel. He said, the gospel is so precious, it's so powerful, it's so wonderful that I'm willing to be persecuted because the hurt of my persecution is nothing to the value of the gospel. You see, the gospel of Jesus Christ is a different level of good news than every other conversation. And when it's announced, it imparts glory. It brings glory, it brings joy. It brings awe without fear. It brings strength. It brings motivation to respond to the message. It changes atmospheres. It brings the miraculous, but it stirs conflict because it confronts darkness. And Jesus said in Matthew 16 and verse 18, he said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." What is the rock by which Jesus builds his church? This gospel. This gospel, which is the message of the power unto salvation. Just a very quick story before I close what I'm saying. John Wesley, who lived probably about 200 years ago in England, and he was traveling on his horse one day to go to a meeting, and he was held up by they call them highwayman, a man with a gun who demanded his money. So John Wesley took his money purse and threw it to the man, and the man rode off with John Wesley's money. And John Wesley went on his way to the meeting. And sometime later, John Wesley was preaching to a certain crowd. Before this, and as the man was riding away, John Wesley called out after him and said these words, "The blood of Jesus Christ cleanses from all sin." The blood of Jesus Christ cleanses from all sin. And that man rode away. And sometime later, John Wesley was preaching to a certain crowd, And a man came to the front and he said, "Mr. Wesley, can I say something to you?" And he said, "You don't know me, but I know you. I was the man who pointed my gun at you and I said, 'Give me your money.' And when you threw that money to me, you called out after me and you said, 'The blood of Jesus Christ cleanses from all sin.'" And he said, "When I rode away, those words could not get out of my mind. Those words went round and round in my mind, and I couldn't get rid of them until I found peace and I found the cleansing that's in the blood of Jesus." And he said, "So I have to come here to repay the money that I stole from you." And here it is. The power of the gospel. You see, it's not just a message that we hear. It's a message with extreme power. A message that brings joy, that brings glory, that transforms life. God bless you.